Hi, thanks for coming to my first ever YouTube video. I really appreciate it. I'm Mel. I've been making TikToks about books and fandom for over a year now, and my harebrained ideas can no longer be contained to a 3-minute time limit, so here we are. This video is going to be about Captive Prince, the genre-bending cult follower having book series that's part fantasy, part romance, part adventure, part politics, and completely gay. It's a deeply polarizing series that's beloved by many, but it's been criticized from a lot of angles, some of which are valid, others distinctly less valid. Among other things, I'm going to be discussing those criticisms and what I hope is good faith, but I'm not going to pretend I'm not biased. I love these books. They mean a lot to me, and I think they have a place in queer literary history. We're going to talk about all that. But first I want to talk about Heartstopper. In the spring of this year, the highly anticipated, highly anticipated in my very bookish, nerdy corner of the internet, so the highly anticipated by some TV adaptation of Alice Oseman's beloved Heartstopper webcomic turned graphic novel series was released on Netflix. The show is a warm, tender, good-hearted, deeply uncynical story about two teen boys falling in love, and the reception's been pretty good. It manages to resonate with queer people while remaining relatively non-threatening to most well-adjusted straights. It's also exactly the kind of wholesome queer story that I didn't have access to or even know that I wanted when I was growing up in the 90s and aughts, and I'm thrilled it exists. But I haven't watched it. I also haven't read the books yet. I own them, but so far I haven't been able to actually make myself sit down and read them. Thinking about reading them actually fills me with a kind of anxious sadness and dread that up until recently I've been putting off examining too closely. But when the adaptation was released on Netflix, I started seeing a lot of videos from people around my age like this.
Yeah, you bleed just to know you're alive. And I don't want the world to see me, 'cause I
Okay, fine. I love you more than my dogs. I love you more than anyone, actually. Isn't it?
So happy for them.
Me too. So happy for them.
I'm so happy and not at all jealous.
The show honestly made me depressed. I can't even imagine having anything close to that be my experience in high school. And so watching the show kind of just like really confronted me with everything that I didn't have in high school because I didn't feel like couldn't be myself.
I just can't help but think, like, if this or a similar show were around when I were younger and in the closet, like, it just would have made a world of a difference, and I just would have hated myself a little less.
And these reactions help me understand that my urge to avoid Heartstopper, even though I know it would resonate with me, is grief for my adolescent self. Because this was a story I needed then. And now that it's here and I'm 32, in some ways for me it feels kind of too late. The version of myself who would have found comfort and belonging and future-oriented hope in the story no longer exists. And I grieve for them. So I grew up in semi-rural, deeply conservative Western Kentucky in the late 90s and early aughts. I was a lonely kid who was always interested in the arts both as a means of expression and a means of escape. I didn't understand well into my adulthood that I was queer. When I was a kid, I just knew that I was suffering on the inside, but I didn't fully understand why. I just knew that the more I tried to mold myself into the girl I felt like I was supposed to be, the more uncomfortable I felt, the more I drew in on myself, the more convinced I was that there was just something innately wrong with me, the more I found myself deeply relating to art that explored trauma, darkness, isolation, and pain. And I don't think I was alone in that experience. Most of the mainstream queer media of the 90s and aughts that I knew about and had access to was defined by trauma, pain, and tragedy. And that's for a lot of reasons, partly because back then, and still for many people today, the queer experience was an isolated and traumatic one. Part of it was a legitimate expression of grief stemming from the AIDS epidemic, but it was also about money. Because when queer people were allowed to be involved in the telling of their own stories at all, they were still constrained by the bottom lines of studios and publishers who demanded they cater to the largest possible demographic. In other words, you could tell queer stories sometimes, but they have to be able to be enjoyed by cis straight people. These stories, even when they centered queer characters, did so in conversation with a presumably straight audience prioritizing straight hearts, straight minds, and straight money. That's why queer death within them was so commonplace. To a presumed majority straight audience, the death of a queer character is tragic but ultimately acceptable, because their function in the story is so often to be seen as inspiration to the people whose lives actually matter. This phenomenon isn't new or exclusive to queer people. The stories of marginalized people that actually make it to the mainstream are so defined by individual tragedy interspersed with occasional bootstrappy triumph, often made possible by a straight white audience surrogate, that they don't leave any room to think about the systems of injustice at play. They're designed to make the presumably straight, presumably white audience feel like they're the good ones while safely avoiding any revolutionary thought. If you were a queer person in the 90s and aughts and you wanted queer stories that sought to capture the totality of queer experience, the trauma and darkness alongside the legitimacy and joy, you had to write them yourself. Online fandom changed the game for queer representation in the 90s and aughts in ways that have directly impacted the boom in queer stories we're seeing in traditional publishing today. And I do mean directly. It's become increasingly common for emerging authors, especially queer authors, to credit their involvement in fandom as an important early influence. If not writing it, then certainly reading it, including C.S. Pacat. Early online fandom was so appealing to queer readers and writers because it tapped into communities of people with niche shared interests and experiences, allowing them to make connections that would have been much harder to make in real life, partly because being out in real life could be so dangerous. Despite the prevalent and apocryphal idea that fanfic writers are mostly cis-het teen girls writing about boys kissing, queer people have been in fandom writing our own stories since the beginning, and our place in fandom was not always a given. People wanting to write fanfic shipping non-canonically queer characters, which was most characters in queer relationships, did so according to the whims of whoever ran the website or group they were attempting to post to. Even the bigger fanfic platforms that were gaining traction, like fanfiction.net, were notoriously unpredictable about enforcing rules, and smaller self-moderated communities were often controlled not by raging homophobes, but by people who thought certain non-canonical pairings were icky or gross and couldn't quite articulate why. So they'd often use the excuse of upholding the sanctity of the mostly cis-straight canon as a means to defend their queerphobia. The overall tone of fanfic was different back then too. First of all, choosing a fanfic to read at all was much more of a game of chance than it is today. There was no universally agreed upon tagging system, and providing content warnings was not the norm. Age ratings were commonplace, but rating systems varied from site to site and group to group and often required insider knowledge, think the Citrus scale. Young people were in fandom, I was one of them, but it was generally assumed to be aimed more at adults than it is today, in part because at this time adults were the ones more likely to have consistent internet access. So I would generally describe the average early aughts fanfic to be darker than it is today, both in tone and subject matter. And I think that darkness was a direct byproduct of the mainstream queer media we did have access to at the time, which centered tragedy and trauma. But even in straight media, we're getting to a grim, dark post 9/11 era in which our shared stories really became interested in exploring the worst kinds of things that could happen to people. So in early online fandom, we have this middle space. We have queer people writing their own stories, but they're not doing it in a vacuum. They're still influenced by mainstream traditional media. So we have a lot of the darkness, trauma, and pain we get from the vanishingly few queer stories in mainstream media, but crucially, we also see queer fanfic authors carve out space for love and joy and happy endings. And people were writing these stories in their own small, mostly self-moderated communities, and once those shared communities were established, authors realized they didn't necessarily have to stick exclusively to fanfic to retain their audience. Talented, enterprising writers who'd been excluded from traditional publishing were now able to capitalize on a space shared by fandom to create their own original stories with all of these complicated queer dynamics in the form of serial fiction. This is the fertile soil from which Captive Prince grew. Captive Prince began as serial online original fiction on LiveJournal in 2008. Pacat says she never expected to actually get published because, well, in 2008 there really wasn't anything like Captive Prince being published. The early serialized version of the story attracted a lot of online attention, leading Pacat to self-publish the first book in 2013 before being acquired by Penguin Random House, who published the second book, Prince's Gambit, in 2015, followed by King's Rising in 2016. Pacat's influences include traditionally published works like Berserk and Game of Kings, but she was also influenced by fanfiction, which she wrote herself before beginning Captive Prince. And of course, fanfiction, which unabashedly centers the emotional lives and romantic fulfillment of its characters, is influenced by and borrows tropes from genre romance. In that vein, Captive Prince has inherited a lot specifically from bodice rippers, a romance subgenre popular in the 70s and 80s, characterized by the romantic hero also being the villain. Like Captive Prince, these books are often complex adventure stories that begin with an act of violence, often the sexual assault of the heroine. And like Captive Prince, these books are often maligned and misunderstood. These stories are complicated, difficult, but often therapeutic and rewarding exercises in empathy. Exploring through fiction what motivates people to do terrible violence and what can motivate them to change is a question it's normal to want an answer to, and that art has and will continue to explore for as long as art exists. But it was especially relevant in queer media during this time, which was looking for ways to process and incorporate a lot of grief, trauma, and pain in ways that could still leave room for a happily ever after. One interesting thing about bookish fandoms is that individual fan experiences are often isolated and delayed. Contrast that with movie and TV fandoms. They're often formed around these mass cultural events anchored to a specific time time in our shared memory. Like when I think about The Dark Knight, I will always think about the summer of 2008, and when I rewatch it, I still see it through that lens and with a general contextual awareness of the other movies made at that time, movies that influenced those movies, as well as the movies that The Dark Knight went on to influence. And that awareness doesn't excuse the stuff that The Dark Knight does wrong, like it doesn't help the Christian Bale Batman voice sound any less goofy.
Do I look like a clown?
But it does help put it into context. Books don't really have a lot of the time-sensitive contextual cues that other forms of art have, or if they do, they're stretched out on a much longer timeline. So people pick up Captive Prince without a solid understanding of the fact that it began life in 2008 as an online serial, and how that inception has dramatically impacted its tone and subject matter. And that's gonna affect your opinions and interpretations, because things have changed a lot very quickly, and the expectations around what kinds of queer stories are okay to tell have changed a lot too. Captive Prince is wrestling with some messy 2008 queer trauma in a world that expects 2022 caliber good representation of it. Heartstopper Wholesome is one way to tell queer stories, and it's a great way, but it's not the only way. So what's the deal? What the hell happens in these books?
L'immensité du firmament proclame, ô Dieu, ta gloire. Proclame, ô Dieu, ta gloire.
Captive Prince is a violent, dark, and occasionally disturbing series to which literally all of the common content warnings apply. Here is a fairly exhaustive list, and we're going to be talking about a lot of this in detail in this video, so please proceed carefully if you choose to proceed at all. Please take care of yourself. I will also be spoiling literally everything that happens in these books, so if you haven't read them yet and you want to, just click the little watch later button and come back when you're ready. So here's the thing you've got to understand about Captive Prince and Pakat as a writer, and it's just that she's brilliant. She's an excellent writer of fantasy in particular. And one of the things that makes her excellent is that she has an incredibly keen instinct for telling us only exactly what we need to know when we need to know, and no more than that. Captive Prince is an example of how to write a fantasy series without ever once relying on an info dump. She builds this world and the inner lives of her characters so pragmatically and so consistently throughout these 3 books that the cumulative effect is that of 2 stories being told at once. One is the current unfolding of events as they're being conveyed to us through our protagonist Damon's observations, and the other story simultaneously being told is Damon piecing together the context of the events that are currently unfolding. There were certain things about his life and his past and the world that Damon believed to be true at the beginning of the story that Damon learns, and we learn by extension, are only a small piece of the picture. So by the time you're finished with these books, you have a completely different understanding of their beginning. So to talk about these books, the most important thing to understand about them is what happens before they even begin. A series of events that takes reading all 3 books to actually piece together. Again, ultra mega spoiler warning. The king is dead. Long live the king. Actually, no, wait, rewind a bit. The queen is dead. The Queen of Vir, along with all the alliances she brought over to Vir from her native country in the west. And with her death, King Theomedes of Akela sees an opportunity to seize Delpha, a territory of neighboring Vir and whose citizens largely consider themselves Varetian. He wants Akela to be more powerful, and the way he sees to do that is imperialist expansion. The conflict escalates, and on one fateful day, 6 years before the first book begins, Varetian and Akelon forces clash at Marlis. King Alaron of Vir is there, along with his sons, Crown Prince Auguste, and then 13-year-old Prince Laurent, as well as the king's brother, who's an important player in this story, but we only ever know him as his future title, the Regent. And on the Akelon side, we have King Theomedes and his sons, Castor, who's the oldest, and then 19-year-old Crown Prince Damianos, who we'll call Damon, who's the hero of our story, and excluding 2 chapters in the prologue, is our sole point of view character for the entire series. Despite Damon being younger than Castor, Damon is first in line to inherit his father's throne because he's the only true born child of King Theomedes, Damon's mother being the late Queen Egeria, while Castor is Theomedes' illegitimate son with his longtime mistress, Hypermnestra. Damon loves Castor as an older brother and often seeks his approval, whereas Castor feels thinly veiled contempt for Damon, who he doesn't think should inherit the throne before him. His contempt is thinly veiled to everyone but Damon, that is, whose ideas about honor and loyalty often blind him to the true depths that people are capable of sinking to in order to get what they want. So at Marlis, Damon, who stayed back from the fighting to protect the king, sees an opportunity. Damon challenges Prince Auguste in hand-to-hand combat and wins, and the effect on Varetian morale is immediate and profound, quickly turning the tide of the battle. To Damon, his actions were honorable. He ended the war, but killing Auguste immediately and irrevocably earns him the scorn of Varetians, along with the moniker Prince Killer. So amidst the chaos, the Varetian king Alaron is also killed by a stray arrow, which we eventually learn wasn't a stray arrow at all, but an assassination orchestrated by his brother, the man who becomes the regent. With King Alaron and Prince Auguste dead, 13-year-old Laurent, raised as his second son, is now crowned prince and next in line to be king. But the Council of Vir agrees he's too young to rule, and that they'll rule in his stead, advising the king's brother, now the regent, until Laurent comes of age at 21. Laurent bears bears underscoring is a child who's recently lost his mother and now his father and his beloved older brother in a single day. His only remaining family member is the regent, who, by contrast, has just gotten everything he ever wanted. He's ruling Vir ostensibly in Laurent's stead, even though he never plans to give up the throne. The regent is also a predator and a pedophile, and with his brother King Aileron and nephew Auguste dead, there's now no one left to protect Laurent from the regent's sexual and emotional abuse. 6 years pass. Now, the king is dead. Long live the king. Specifically, this time, King Theomedes of Aklos is dead, and the story proper begins with a coup. Castor has poisoned the king and smuggled Damon, the crown prince and would-be rightful king of Aklos, into Vir, disguised as a pleasure slave in the palace at Arla, along with several other trained palace slaves, framed as a diplomatic gesture of goodwill from one nascent usurper king, Castor, to another soon-to-be usurper king, the regent. But the gift isn't really a gift at all. It's an exchange, a deal brokered between two usurper kings. Castor bought the troops he needed to seize the capital for himself during the coup from the regent, in exchange for Damon and 24 other enslaved Accolons. The regent, in turn, made this deal in part because he wants to taunt Laurent with his brother's killer in the hopes of goading him into a violent reaction that he can use as an excuse to send Laurent off to border duty as a punishment so the regent can take the capital in his absence and start calling himself king. It works. And the fact that Laurent is celibate and Damon is given to him as a pleasure slave is icing on the cake. If they don't have sex, the regent can continue to emasculate Laurent and goad him about how there's something inherently defective about him. And if they do have sex, the regent can reveal the fact that Damon killed Auguste and taunt Laurent about that too. It's a lose-lose situation. Now at this point you may be asking yourself, why would Castor ship Damon off to Vir when it would be so much safer for Castor's claim to the throne to just kill him? The answer is the true secret MVP of the series, Yocaste. Yocaste and Damon were lovers before King Theomedes' death, but Yocaste, being more cunning and politically savvy than Damon, sensed the turning tides. As King Theomedes became ill, she knew that Castor was going to make a play for the throne, and this wasn't exactly kept secret from Damon either. Damon was warned of these threats, but chose not to believe them out of a misguided sense of familial loyalty, choosing his idea of honor over the facts on the ground. Knowing that Damon wouldn't survive Castor on the throne if she didn't do anything, Yocaste began an affair with Castor, earning his trust enough to appeal to his jealous, vengeful nature and convince him to punish Damon by sending him to Vir instead of killing him outright, thus ensuring his survival, at least temporarily. So Damon is held captive in Vir, intended as a gift for Crown Prince Laurent. This is an extremely dangerous situation for Damon because not only is he being held captive in a hostile foreign country at his enemy's mercy, but he personally killed Laurent's brother, thus ensuring Laurent's wrath if he were to ever find out his true identity. So it's safer for him to pretend he's not who he really is. We find out much later, of course, that Laurent knew exactly who Damon was the entire time, which explains but does not excuse Laurent's torrent of abuse in the first book. Damon's main priority during this time is escape, both for himself and the other enslaved Accolons, which he halfway accomplishes, but he keeps getting roped into all these schemes, including an attempt on Laurent's life for which Damon was intended to be framed, and so by the end of the first book, Damon's formed a tentative alliance with Laurent against the regent. The next two books are where the series really shines, but we don't really need to go over their events in detail to be able to talk about the series as a whole. Basically, the second two books consist of Damon and Laurent's misadventures while fighting for their respective crowns, their fledgling trusts, their eventual love story, and their final confrontations with the regent and Castor. Okay, here's the part where I admit that I am extremely nervous to talk about these books. When I announced on TikTok I was going to be doing this essay, I had some people reach out to me and tell me to be careful, basically. Not in a threatening way, it's just that these are very polarizing books, and we're at a moment in media criticism where events that take place in fiction are often seen as authorial endorsement by default, regardless of how those events are framed in the text. And in my year in the book talk trenches, I've learned that if you publicly attach yourself to a piece of media, it starts to be seen as a facet of your persona, like a signifier of your personal brand or like an extension of your aesthetic. And so, according to the transitive property of modern media discourse, all the sins of that piece of media are now therefore your sins. When we're all churning out highly consumable, algorithm-friendly content about media, it's much easier to tear down than build up. And when we're done tearing down the original thing, we often move on to the people who like the thing. Now, I'll tell you right now, I do think there are some aspects of these books that are problematic, but I am deeply suspicious of the way I often see those aspects being discussed in this gotcha CinemaSins thing you like is bad actually style. Not all problematic media is created equally, and most if not all media has problematic aspects because we live in a problematic world. I say that not to dismiss concerns, but to invite a more nuanced conversation about them instead of, tossing the books in the dumpster and then setting the dumpster on fire. The media that resonates with me is most often media that confronts difficult subjects head on, but in doing that, authors are gonna make mistakes, and C.S. Pacat is no exception. Slavery has existed in some form or fashion for all of recorded human history. But to have a conversation about slavery today, we've got to keep in mind that our modern understanding of slavery, as well as the forms of slavery that still exist today, are the direct descendants of the uniquely evil intersections of settler colonialism, white supremacy, and capitalism, beginning with the kidnapping and enslavement of Africans at the hands of white Europeans in the 1600s. A lot of fantasy, including Captive Prince, depicts a non-race-based, more ancient-inspired model of slavery, emulating something closer to what we'd see in the Odyssey or Beowulf. And of course, these forms of slavery aren't moral or ethical either, but they are more distant. And in fantasy, that abstraction that distance creates is crucial, because feeling personally removed from the stakes of the fantasy world helps you better empathize and make new connections in ways that your everyday biases might prevent you from doing. But books are not written in a vacuum. Whether their authors are consciously aware of it or not, contemporary depictions of slavery are always, in some way, in conversation with the legacy of transatlantic chattel slavery, so far-reaching and pernicious are its effects. The American Civil War and the resulting abolition of slavery coincided, not coincidentally, with the height of minstrelsy, which popularized and codified anti-black tropes that became common in depictions of black people up through the Jim Crow era and are still present in media being created today. Often unintentionally, mind you, but that doesn't make them less harmful. Since these tropes were literally designed and employed to advance white supremacy, we need to look at media that's interacting with them very carefully. Because all pieces of media are in perpetual conversation with each other. Our readings of one informed by our readings of another, on and on forever. Some of the most vocal criticisms of Captive Prince are in response to Damon's period of captivity at the palace at Arla, for which the series and the first book are ostensibly named. Put a pin in that. So let's talk about how slavery is depicted in these books. In Achelos, slavery is legal and commonplace, especially among royalty, of which Damon is not only a member, but one of the most important members. He's the crown prince. In other words, before his own period of captivity, Damon owned slaves, and he didn't feel even a little bit bad about it. Because to him, that's just the way things are and have always been. That's the way his father did things, and his father before him. And that's an explanation, not an excuse. I'm going to be saying that a lot today. So how slavery works in Achelos, at least the glimpse that we see, is that enslaved people are groomed, educated, and trained through childhood and adolescence in closed-off, tight-knit, hand-selected groups, a bit like cult indoctrination. They're taught the practical skills they'll be expected to perform, including sex work, but also things like etiquette and how to entertain. They're also psychologically groomed to believe that slavery is an honor. This is the background of the enslaved people who are smuggled with Damon into Vir. Now, in Vir, slavery is illegal. There is an exploited underclass of contract sex workers, colloquially called pets. Crucially, they are paid, and they are technically able to leave, even though the logistics of that decision can be complicated and sometimes deadly. So Castor's gift of Damon and the other enslaved Achelons is a sort of awkward diplomatic exception made to bolster the nascent alliance between Vir and Achelos. And it's ostensibly tolerated so as not to offend Castor. I say ostensibly because we know it's actually a shady backroom deal brokered between the regent and Castor. So Damon knows he can't fool anyone into thinking he's a real palace slave because it's highly skilled work and he hasn't had the same intense instruction as the rest of his cohort. So instead he pretends to be a regular soldier who got on Castor's bad side and was enslaved and sent to Vir as punishment. But Damon is not as sneaky as he thinks. Both Laurent and the regent know exactly who he is the entire time, and they also know how important their possession of Damon is to the stability of both Vir and Achelos. He's an incredibly valuable, arguably the most valuable player in the game. Although Damon is routinely and casually, in my opinion, too casually, referred to as a slave, it's more accurate to think of him as a political prisoner, and that's reflected in his relationship dynamic with Laurent, even if he doesn't know that Laurent knows his true identity yet. In that relationship dynamic, where Laurent is holding Damon captive as a sex slave, but actually a political prisoner, is a lightning rod for criticism. And like I said before, the optics are challenging. Whether Picot intended it or not, the imagery of a person of color in chains and enslaved to a white man is so powerfully evocative of transatlantic chattel slavery, regardless of any in-text justification, that for some people it's just gonna be too much, and that's okay. Furthermore, I'm aware that my own ability to stomach it is inextricable from my own whiteness. But since we are going to talk about it, I don't think we should ignore all the other relevant information that puts Damon and Laurent's relationship into context. I often see Damon and Laurent's romantic relationship, which doesn't develop until much later in the books, criticized for the same reason that all relationships pairing oppressor and oppressed are criticized, but I don't think that framework quite works here. To compare, let's look at an oppressed-oppressor relationship dynamic in another fantasy world. Draco and Hermione is a massively popular fan pairing within the Harry Potter fandom, but a lot of people have ethical issues with it, because Draco was a member of a blood supremacist cult working to actively exterminate Muggle-born witches and wizards like Hermione. Even if the fan work pairing them together is depicting a fully reformed Draco, they live in a world that ensures he will always have the power and control in their relationship in ways both obvious and subtle. In every space they occupy together in the wizarding world, there will be people who see Draco as more fundamentally worthy of his magic, i.e. his autonomy, his freedom, his humanity, than Hermione. That is not the type of relationship that Damon and Laurent have. Damon's captivity is highly situational, and Damon and Laurent's relationship is much more reminiscent of Jaime and Brienne from Game of Thrones. Jaime and Brienne first meet when Jaime is the Stark's prisoner, and Catelyn asks that Brienne escort him back to King's Landing in exchange for Sansa and Arya. That obviously doesn't work out. Anyway, in this tumultuous political fantasy world, Jaime is currently in a very vulnerable position, but at the end of the day, he's a fucking Lannister. He's in a low spot now, but we know and he knows that this is temporary, and there will come a day when he and Brienne will face each other as equals. And it's the waiting for that ground to level out that makes them so interesting to watch. Similarly at Arla, Daemon knows he's in a dangerous situation, but he's Damianos of Akalos. He's very confident about his place in the world, and his agency is expressed constantly through his narration, where he never for a single moment stops plotting his escape and his inevitable return home, where he will proceed to rule an entire country. Laurent seems to understand this and accept it as inevitable too. The fact that Daemon is so privileged and has thoughtlessly benefited from slavery his entire life is part of the point and represents the beginning of his emotional arc in the story. Like I mentioned earlier, Daemon is not the only enslaved Accolon in Vir, and he soon learns that his fellow Accolons are being tortured and abused. Even though Viretians see slavery itself as backwards and barbaric, it doesn't compel them to extend any compassion towards the enslaved Accolons, and the enslaved Accolons who have been groomed, traumatized, and brainwashed since childhood aren't really in a position to navigate the court politics of a foreign country whose language they don't speak. So Daemon's priority in the first book becomes getting them out. Notice I didn't say getting them free, because Daemon, and this is where things get interesting, despite his own captivity, doesn't really believe at this point that they should be free. Daemon's stance on slavery at the beginning of the series is a lot like that of pre-Civil War liberals who wanted to focus their political efforts on bettering the treatment of enslaved African Americans as opposed to actually freeing them. Individually, they might have found slavery abhorrent, but their beliefs about private property, embedded in them the racist idea that enslaved African Americans could be property in the first place, kept them from coming to the conclusion that abolition is the only moral and ethical solution to the problem of slavery. And these liberals coexisted with actual abolitionists who understood that the institution of slavery itself was the problem, and that no human being should ever be enslaved regardless of how kind their master is. And so Daemon, raised from his childhood to be king and thus in the position to benefit most from slavery, at the beginning of the story does not believe the institution of slavery itself to be the problem, despite his own captivity. The problem, he thinks, isn't that his fellow Accolons are enslaved in the first place, it's just that the Varetian courtiers treat them badly. This hypocrisy is an intentional choice by Paquette, and we know that because Laurent directly calls him out on it.
Do you visit brothels often? No, said Daemon. Not brothels. Camp followers, said Laurent, and then slaves. And then, after the satisfaction of a pause, Akalos, the garden of delights. So you enjoy slavery in others, just not in yourself.
A big part of Daemon's journey and a core theme of the books is learning that freedom is always the right choice, even when it's difficult and uncharted. Daemon and Laurent have an explicit conversation about this in King's Rising.
When servants entered to clear the plates from the table, Laurent watched them come and go and then looked at Daemon. There was an unspoken question in his words. You are not keeping slaves in your household. I can't imagine why, said Daemon. If you've forgotten what to do with a slave, I can tell you, said Laurent. You hate the idea of slavery. It turns your stomach. Daemon said it, a flat statement of truth. If I'd been anyone else, you would have freed me on the first night. He searched Laurent's face. When I argued the case for slavery in Arles, you didn't try to change my mind. It is not a subject for an exchange of ideas. There is nothing to say. There will be slaves in Akalos. We are a slave culture. I know that. Daemon said, Are pets and their contracts so different? Did Nicaise have a choice? He had the choice of the poor with no other way to survive, the choice of a child powerless to his elders, the choice of a man when his king gives him an order, which is no choice at all, and yet still more than is afforded to a slave.
And by the end of the series, Daemon has gone from a liberal who just believes that enslaved people need to be treated better to a king who's vowed to abolish slavery entirely. But we have a couple problems here, and this is where we're going to get into some of my biggest criticisms of the series. The first problem is structural. These are not very interior books, and that's a compliment. We're told the story almost exclusively through Daemon's limited third-person perspective, and Daemon is a man of action. He spends very little time in internal monologue. Instead, he's very consistently grounded in the moment, making observations about what's currently happening to and around him, which as far as reading experiences go is fantastic. The forward momentum of these books is incredible, but a consequence of that style of narration is that it's very easy for the reader to forget that we are indeed reading a single character's limited perspective that's colored by his own biases and flaws. Like I said earlier, the effect of Picot's writing is often very cumulative, and we only begin to understand the extent of Damon's pre-existing biases at the beginning of the story once those biases are challenged by his lived experience. And then we see them begin to change, and we see that change through his actions, not his internal monologue. We can see a more benign example of this phenomenon through Damon's reactions to Venetian architecture. So here are his observations about the palace in Arlen, the first book.
As for the room, everywhere he looked his eyes were assaulted with ornamentation. The walls were overrun by decoration. The wooden doors were delicate as a screen, and carved with a repeated design that included gaps in the wood. Through them you could glimpse shadowy impressions of what lay on the other side. The windows were similarly screened. Even the floor tiles were party-colored and arranged in a geometric pattern. Everything gave the impression of patterns within patterns, the twisty creations of the Venetian mind.
And compare that to his observations at Marlis and King's Rising, after he spent months working alongside Venetians.
Damon looked at the courtyard. The parapets were broken down and reshaped, the stonework hacked off. The stone itself carted off for use in new building, the splendid rooftops and towers leveled into an Acheron style. Damon told himself he thought Venetian ornamentation wasteful. In Arles, his eyes had begged for relief. He had wished daily for a stretch of plain wall. All he could see now was the empty floor with its tiles pulled up, the ruined ceiling, the bare, painfully stripped stone.
He never consciously has the thought, wow, I suddenly appreciate Venetians and their culture and understand that just because their perspectives are different than mine doesn't mean they're worse. But we still get that through his observations about the world around him. It's subtle, it's brilliant, and Damon's stance on slavery evolves in a similar way. But the problem comes in with this perennial debate over how completely each individual installment of a series should be able to stand on its own. And it's a hard balance, but I think that each book in a series should be able to be read and understood as a single book. And I think the first Captive Prince book fundamentally fails at that, and that failure is reflected in a lot of the criticism. Each of the three books is a complete action-adventure story, but emotionally they function more as individual acts of a three-act play, which is why if I ruled the world, Captive Prince would have gotten the Priory of the Orange Tree treatment. It'd just be one big honkin' book. And I think that would have made Damon's emotional arc a lot more cohesive. There is another problem, and it's a big one, with Picot's depiction of slavery that is not fixed in the later books. In fact, it's only compounded in the later books. We'll call it the Erasmus problem. Erasmus is an enslaved Acheron young man. He smuggled with Damon and their cohort in Navir as part of the Regent and Castor's shady deal, and like I mentioned earlier, he and the other enslaved Achelons are tortured by bored Venetian courtiers who basically see them as zoo animals. Damon is rightly horrified by this treatment, and one of his major motivators in the first book, the thing that inspires him to try to cut a deal with Laurent, is the desire to help Erasmus and the other enslaved Achelons get out of Vir. The route he sees to achieve this is to convince Laurent to transfer ownership of the slaves as part of a trade deal with Patras, a country in which, like Achelos, slavery is legal and commonly practiced. This is Damon's ideal solution, because like we discussed, Damon does not yet fully understand it's not the poor treatment of slaves that's the problem, it's the institution of slavery itself. Even though Damon does eventually come to understand this, it's still a problem here because, well, remember when I said this? Books are not written in a vacuum. Whether their authors are consciously aware of it or not, contemporary depictions of slavery are always, in some way, in conversation with the legacy of transatlantic chattel slavery, so far-reaching and pernicious are its effects. Yeah, so Erasmus is an example of the happiness in slavery trope. Historically, proponents of slavery use this trope to argue that slavery wasn't wrong because black people enjoyed being enslaved and serving white people, actually. In this trope, black servants and slaves are depicted as being deeply devoted to the white families they serve, so that attempts to emancipate them can be painted as cruel, because don't you see how dependent they are on these white families to provide them with meaning and purpose? Although at its roots this is an anti-black trope, there's a class dimension to it too, especially in more recent iterations. Even if the servants depicted aren't people of color, Erasmus himself is described as having fair skin and gold hair, there's still this idea that there are certain kinds of people who are naturally happier and more fulfilled serving other people, specifically rich and powerful people, because they're the ones whose lives actually matter. Towards the end of Captive Prince, Erasmus says,
I was always taught that a slave's duty was sacred, that we honored our masters through submission, and they honored us in return, and I believed that. But when you said that you were sent here as punishment, I understood that for men here, there is no honor in obedience, and it is shameful to be a slave. Perhaps I had already started to understand that, even before you spoke to me. I tried to tell myself that it was an even greater submission, to become nothing, to have no value, but I couldn't. I think it is in my nature to submit, as it is not in yours. But I need someone to belong to.
And that's the culmination of his story. That's it. That's where he ends up, feeling like he needs someone to belong to be personally fulfilled. And I hate it. So there's the engaging with harmful anti-Black tropes problem, and there's also a thematic plot hole problem. Finding freedom is a major theme of the books, therefore it's important for everyone we care about in the story to be both symbolically and literally free by the end. Erasmus is not. So yeah, even though Damon vows to abolish slavery, and getting to know Erasmus was a key step to Damon arriving at that conclusion, the abolition does not actually apply to Erasmus. Damon saving him from the palace required Erasmus to move with Torvald to Patras, where slavery is still legal, and outside of either Damon or Laurent's jurisdiction. And I think that sucks. I do not like it. The critics are right about this one. That's it. That's the end of the section. The splashiest, most attention-grabbing criticism surrounding Captive Prince has to do with the assaults that Damon endures in the first book. Specifically, there's the attempted rape that Damon ultimately escapes, the incredibly violent physical assault that leaves him permanently scarred, and the public sexual assault. All of these incidents are either engineered or enabled by Laurent, who at the time is motivated by his visceral hatred of Damon because, well, Damon killed his brother, a death that took away Laurent's last remaining loving caretaker and ushered in the darkest period of his life. Explanation, not excuse. The physical assault almost kills and permanently scars Damon, but the most intense criticism I've seen focuses on the sexual assault. So that's what we're going to dig into today. I know I did the content warning up top, but we're about to get into some really dark stuff regarding the specifics of the assault Damon endures, so please proceed with caution. The sexual assault itself is carried out in public, which is common in the decadent and depraved Parisian court. It's conceptualized by Vans, whose name I did not look up how to pronounce.
Van.
It's fantasy French. Anyway, it's conceptualized by Vans, witnessed by Berenger, carried out by Ansel, and aided and abetted by Laurent. Ansel, for reference, is an ambitious contract sex worker who's angling to impress Laurent in hopes of scoring a contract with him, unaware of the extent of Laurent's celibacy or the true nature of his relationship with Damon. Laurent understands this and manipulates it into an opportunity to further abuse Damon. The brilliance and the horror of this scene is that it's only the competing and interlocking motivations of the perpetrators as a group that make it possible. None of these characters individually are evil, but together they're capable of committing this evil act that none of them, not even Laurent, would have committed in isolation. And that really hits on something for me. So I've never experienced an assault in a group setting like Damon does, but when considering experiences I have had and the experiences of other people I know, it's not a big leap for me to put myself in Damon's shoes. Over a decade ago, I had an abusive boyfriend who, among other things, would make degrading jokes about our sex life in front of our friends, and they would almost always proceed to laugh and play along, and the purpose of that exercise was to simultaneously bolster his own ego while humiliating me. The boyfriend was ultimately at fault, of course, but any one of those friends could have put a stop to it, at least in the moment. They never did. The best they would ever do was apologize to me later, always in private, and proceed to change nothing about their behavior in public. These experiences were especially painful because individually I didn't think of any of these guys as bad people. Individually, I would have called some of them if my car broke down, and I know they would have helped. And I didn't have the framework then to parse that incongruity. So instead I took all the shame and blame on myself, not even totally understanding at the time that it was shame I was feeling. Damon's assault showcases how people, often men, but certainly not exclusively men, enable each other to do violence they wouldn't be capable of individually, and how frighteningly easy it can be to justify that violence. It's a disturbing, complicated, difficult to read scene, and its most virulent critics seem to agree with me on that. What we don't agree on is that just because the events of the scene transpire the way they do doesn't mean Picard endorses them. Specifically, some people read this scene and think it's meant to be sexy or titillating or erotic, and that's what I want to unpack right there. People, mostly women from what I've seen on Goodreads, seem to think this scene is supposed to function as erotica, and look, I am just one little guy. The truth is they let anybody upload videos onto YouTube. I'm not the arbiter of correct book opinions, but that is not my interpretation of this scene, especially when I look at how starkly it contrasts in tone and content to the consensual love scenes in the later books. Now, I think there is some eroticism in it, but the eroticism is interwoven with so many dark and disturbing elements that it's clear to me what the scene is trying to accomplish is not the reader's titillation. It is a depiction of sexual assault that is aware it's a depiction of sexual assault, and that sexual assault is a bad thing. And I want to gently invite the people who do believe the scene is meant to be titillating to perhaps briefly examine their own biases. We are pattern-oriented creatures, and when we read about a thing happening, we're simultaneously searching our own internal archives or other examples of that thing to compare it to in order to give it meaning and context. But the thing about other depictions of men experiencing sexual assault in media is that there aren't many of them. And when they do exist, they're almost always treated as a joke. Or if the act itself isn't seen as a joke, it's because the man's protests are, the insidious underlying idea being that all men actually want sex all the time. And I think if you read this scene through that latter lens, even subconsciously, you're going to have a very different read of it, and you're probably going to experience some uncomfortable cognitive dissonance that might be influencing your perspective. Let's look at the text itself. One clue that we're not supposed to be reading this as solely erotic is the fact that this is as close to full-blown panic as Daemon ever really gets, at least until things really start popping off in King's Rising. He has this phrase that he says in his internal narration after they lash him to a chair. He thinks to himself, this was really going to happen. And that sends chills down my spine because it's got this hopeless, claustrophobic feel that we don't usually see from Daemon, who's generally very resourceful. And it also really speaks to this specific surreality you can sometimes feel when something terrible is about to happen and it doesn't quite feel real yet. There is a flare of arousal that Daemon feels for Laurent during the scene when Laurent begins to instruct Ansel on how to perform oral sex. But that doesn't mean that Daemon thinks what's happening to him is okay, or that we should either. Daemon literally refers to the arousal he's experiencing as something that's happening to him against his will. As the assault continues and Daemon continues to be aroused, it's clear that he also feels ashamed of that fact. And I don't know about you, but that feeling attraction to someone who's hurting you despite your best interests and feeling deeply ashamed of yourself for it, I can really empathize with that. We're never told the explicit details, but later on in the books it eventually becomes clear that Laurent has some specific trauma regarding oral sex resulting from the abuse inflicted on him as a child by the regent. So Laurent aiding and assaulting Daemon in a way that harkens back to the way that he was assaulted is Laurent deliberately choosing to continue the cycle of abuse, which is an idea he experiments with in different ways throughout the series, but especially in the first book. But we can see even in this scene that it doesn't make him feel good or powerful because it's him doing the same thing his abuser would do. One of my favorite moments in the books comes from Prince's Gambit after Laurent goads his then captain appointed by the regent, Gavar, into a duel that Laurent knows he'll win in order to simultaneously rid himself of Gavar and win the respect of his troops. Afterwards in private, Daemon says to him,
"You broke a man today. Doesn't that affect you at all? These are lives, not pieces in a chess game with your uncle. You're wrong. We are on my uncle's board, and these men are all his pieces. Then each time you move one of them, you can congratulate yourself on how much like him you are."
Then again at the end of Prince's Gambit when Laurent is planning to meet the regent on the field at Charcy and Daemon's trying to talk him out of it.
In a fight, you try to beat your opponent. You don't scurry to do what he wants. This is about more than Charcy. You've never made a single move of your own against your uncle. You let him set the field. You let him make the rules. You play his games like you want to show him you can. Like you're trying to impress him. Is that it?
In the most literal sense, Daemon is talking about Gavar and about Charcy, respectively, but he's also talking about himself and all the other innocent people who have been collateral damage in this fight between the regent and Laurent. And the fight itself is a literal war with literal casualties, but it's also referring to Laurent's participation in the cycle of abuse, including his abuse of Daemon in the first book. The game is the cycle, and what Daemon is saying here is that Laurent has to permanently break the cycle in order to ever be truly free of his uncle. So there's an archetype in Western fiction, and it's always a he, is mysterious, sensual, often androgynous. A lot of the time he's blonde. He's also a manipulator, a traitor, a serial abuser. He can be icy or he can be charismatic, sometimes both, but he's almost always some flavor of morally dubious bully or all-around bad person. You could call him a Spike or a Sephiroth or a Draco in leather pants, for which the trope, at least the fandom iteration of it, gets its name. Draco in leather pants is named for the Frankenstein creation that is Fanon Draco Malfoy. I can't believe I'm talking about Draco Malfoy twice in this goddamn video. I was never even a Draco stan. It's just that unfortunately Harry Potter was my special interest from ages 12 to 17, so inadvertently bringing Harry Potter fan culture into otherwise unrelated analyses is my very special curse. Back in the day when the Harry Potter books were still being written and fans were still trying to piece together everything that was going to happen in the series, it was a pretty popular idea that Draco was going to get some kind of canonical redemption arc. He didn't. But fanfic writers who were interested in exploring Draco's redemption would often give Draco a backstory where he was physically and emotionally abused by his father. This became so commonly accepted in the Harry Potter fandom that you'd be hard-pressed to find a Draco-centric fanfic today in which Lucius was not abusive toward Draco in his childhood, even though there's no canonical evidence that he was. Fans created this abuse backstory in order to justify their interest in Draco as a character, and often to excuse his bigoted and abusive actions in canon. And this phenomenon is not unique to fandom. This archetype exists in all modes of Western storytelling, and it often centers a single moment of internal decision. The moment in which the would-be redeemed bad guy chooses the light instead of the dark. The idea being that the character's soul is saved once they accept the light into their heart. I wonder where we got that wacky idea. One perfect sacrifice, after all, is so much tidier than the never-ending work of trying to do better and inevitably making mistakes, which is why the character often dies after this decision point, lest they pollute their moment of pure ideological choice, a choice that requires no attempt at reparations except for maybe one big symbolic sacrifice. Because in this framing, it's better for the redeemed character to retain his purity than it is for him to imperfectly attempt material change, or worse, to further the leadership of someone more knowledgeable and experienced than him. In these stories, we're told that intention, no matter how late in the game it arrives, is more important than impact. So when Draco and Leather Pants type characters get this kind of redemption in stories, it can be a red flag. It's not that we shouldn't be interested in these characters or what can motivate bad people to want to change. It's more that most media already primes us to be overly sympathetic to violent white men at the expense of the victims of their violence and to value their alleged intentions over their material impact. And when those violent white men decide they're going to be good people now, we're meant to think the change is instantaneous, and we're also kind of just supposed to take their word for it, even though they haven't exactly proven themselves as trustworthy. This is expected of us as viewers and readers because the story, media in general, and the world values the lives of the Dracos over the lives of the people the Dracos have hurt. Laurent is not a Draco in Leather Pants, but a lot of people who don't like these books think he is, and I understand why. He's got a lot of the aesthetic hallmarks. Laurent's character is in conversation with this archetype, but he both moves beyond and actively subverts a lot of its conventions, and it's exactly those subversions that make him such a compelling character. One of these subversions is the fact that in the first book, when Laurent is behaving abusively, Picot doesn't ask or expect us to care about his motivations, because at that point it doesn't matter. Damon's pain is what's rightfully centered, and we only care about Laurent's motivations to the extent that they could aid in Damon's escape. And Damon eventually sees an opportunity in the fracture between Laurent and his uncle, and that's where our initial curiosity comes from. But at that point, it's mostly coming from a desire to exploit his weaknesses to Damon's advantage. We hate Laurent in the first book, rightfully and intentionally so. Even when I was rereading the book and I knew exactly where it was going, I still hated him. Picot specifically talks about how in early drafts, when she was trying to make Laurent too sympathetic too soon, it wasn't working.
I had written a non-successful first draft. I wrote about like 20,000 words of a first draft that didn't work at all. And the reason that it wasn't working was I tried to make Laurent too likable in the beginning. And I remember this flash of insight that I had where I was like, oh, they have to hate him in the beginning, like really hate him.
The reason why, I think, is because Laurent's backstory and us feeling any kind of way about it is just not as important as the abuse he subjects Damon to. We, the readers, and Damon as our surrogate only have the bandwidth to even begin to be interested in Laurent, his backstory, his motivations, after he modifies his behavior. And even then, it takes a while. He and Damon have to find a way to work together by building steadily on each of their previous interactions for that window of curiosity to keep slowly opening up. Laurent has a moment in Prince's Gambit that, in a lesser work, would have been the culmination of his arc.
What Govar said about my brother and I, it wasn't true. I never thought it was, said Damon, uneasily. I mean that whatever taint exists in my family, Auguste was free of it. Taint? I wanted to tell you that because you, said Laurent, as though he was forcing the words out. You remind me of him. He was the best man I have ever known. You deserve to know that, as you deserve at least a fair. In Arles I treated you with malice and cruelty. I will not insult you by attempting to atone for deeds with words, but I would not treat you that way again.
In a lesser work, that intent, that promise would have been enough. But having experienced Laurent's abuses Damon did, it's not enough, and they both know it. The trust between them continues to be quietly and cumulatively earned on top of that promise. And that's the magic of this story. We see hints of Laurent's lingering regret over the way he treated Damon throughout the series, but crucially, Laurent never makes excuses, and he never drags it up again, because keeping his promise means not re-traumatizing Damon by centering his own guilt. book, so it's time to address the last, largest, hairiest remaining elephant in the room. Every piece of media that gains a certain amount of traction that prominently features a romantic relationship between two men, written by anyone other than a cis-out gay man, has been accused of fetishizing queer men, including Captive Prince. On the one hand, I think this is a valid, if sometimes misplaced, reaction to a very real phenomenon, where despite an increase in the amount of queer stories being written overall, romance as a genre in traditional publishing is still very much dominated by cis-het white women who, when they do write queer stories, are mostly writing about cis-queer white men, often without much regard to sensitivity, catering to an audience of presumably cis-straight white women. I say presumably because, of course, we know people of all genders and orientations read romance, but since cis-straight white women are where publishers see the most money to be made, their comfort and accessibility is often prioritized over displaying any sensitivity towards the marginalized groups whose stories they're co-opting. It's kind of like what I was talking about at the beginning of this video, about how when movie and TV studios are willing to tell queer stories, it's often still with a straight audience in mind. And this can and often does result in the careless regurgitation of harmful stereotypes. There should be more space in traditional publishing, and especially in romance, for queer men to tell their own stories, full stop. I think we can all agree on that. But this is probably a good time to mention what I've so far only implied. C.S. Pacat is neither cis nor het, neither am I. And I mention that not to let either of us off the hook, because of course queer people are indeed capable of causing harm in our own communities, but to explain that Pacat is writing these books from an inherently queer perspective, and I'm reading them through a queer lens. In general, I do tend to gravitate towards books about queer men because I see myself, my identity, and my experiences most keenly reflected in stories about queer men. Even as a kid, before I knew myself the way I do now, the characters I felt most connected to in fiction were men and boys who I now recognize were queer-coded in some way. Today, I especially see myself in queer men written by non-binary people, trans men, non-cis men of all stripes, because in those works, more than any other, I find an ingrained willingness to experiment with gender that I don't see in a lot of fiction by cis people, and that's what I find in Captive Prince. You can look at Damon and Laurent and see a skeleton of a harmful stereotype that gets pushed in a lot of more exploitative MLM works, where there's one character who's a caricature of hypermasculinity and the other hyperfemininity, but Damon and Laurent are doing something much more interesting with gender than that. Laurent's physical appearance is often described in very feminine terms, with a lot of emphasis placed on his beauty, poise, and grace, but he has this stoicism, individualism, and strict self-control that we typically associate with peak masculinity. And his weaknesses, too, are those of men who have been hurt by the constraints of patriarchal masculinity. He doesn't know how to ask for help, he doesn't know how to connect with people, and he doesn't know how to be vulnerable, even though it's clear those are all things he desperately needs. Often the only way Laurent is able to express emotion at all is through violent bouts of anger. That's toxic masculinity. Then there's Damon. On the surface, Damon seems like the traditional masculine ideal, but when we get to know him, we see a tenderness and openness with his affections that feels very feminine to me. Damon feels deeply. He's very aware of his own feelings and isn't afraid to, and in fact is very good at articulating them. Damon is one of my favorite characters, like, ever. And someone asked me a while ago what other fictional character Damon most reminded me of, and I started mentally going through a list of like all these warrior hero type characters, but none of them fit. None of them captured why I love Damon so much. And then I realized, oh, that's because Damon is the most like Sarah Crew, the 11-year-old protagonist of A Little Princess. Why? What'd you think I was going to say? Sarah is wealthy and privileged and has a lot of social capital at the beginning of her story, but that's all gradually stripped away from her. But she's able to endure it because at the bottom of everything else, her greatest strength is her love, which she gives openly, even though that's terrifying because she's not always sure she's going to receive love in return. And I find that to be just so beautifully feminine. And it's that femininity, that loving openness that Damon consistently offers Laurent that finally empowers Laurent to trust and to be vulnerable. And on the other side of that choice, we have this whole new non-toxic model of masculinity that's allowed to be shy and inexperienced and to not have all the answers all the time. It's beautiful. Pacat as a writer is very interested in doubles and mirrors and symmetry, in taking things that are almost the same and seeing what happens when they're just slightly different, or in taking very different people and putting them in similar situations and observing the different ways they respond. Castor and Auguste are men in similar circumstances who behave very differently. Damon and Laurent similarly revered them, the difference being that Laurent's love of Auguste was reciprocated, but is gone now that Auguste is dead, and Damon finds out his relationship with Castor was never real, despite Castor still being alive. Nicaise and Erasmus are in similar situations but respond to their circumstances very differently. Jordan and Damon have very similar values and characteristics, but their conflicting loyalties often put them at odds. Laurent and Aymeric have had similar living lived experiences but have responded to the abuse inflicted on them very differently. And Laurent and Yokas are so similar from their looks to their demeanors to their worldviews to, at the very bottom of their cold little hearts, their deep and abiding love for Damon, that it's clear the only meaningful differences between them are luck and timing. So with these motifs in mind, pop quiz, who's the captive prince the title of this series is referring to? You can probably see where I'm going with this because you read the title of the video. It's both. It's both of them. Abstracting out a bit so that captor means perpetrator and captive means victim, it's easy to call Laurent the main perpetrator of violence in the series, but that depends on your definition of violence. Laurent's villainy is flashy and mean-spirited and often spectacularly cruel, but also Laurent prefers diplomacy and compromise to waging war, and he never kills except to save his own life. But what about Damon? He certainly has a lot of high-minded ideas about honor and loyalty, but where have they gotten him? When we meet him, he's been blindly following the same path that his father laid out for him, thoughtlessly participating in slavery and violent imperialism, not out of malevolence, but because it's what he thought he was supposed to do. Until his own captivity, he never even thought to question it. Is that not violence? Damon's complicity comes to a head when he volunteers to duel Auguste in service of a pointless territory war that actively ignores the wishes of the people who live in the contested territory. Auguste's death was an act of state-sanctioned violence, and Damon wasn't just an actor, he was the state. In King's Rising, when Damon and Laurent have entered their formal alliance, but their personal relationship is still fraught, there's a big banquet where Damon's bannermen are coming to pledge their loyalty to him as king. This is the moment that Damon's been working towards since the first page of the first book. The hope of getting here helped him survive his captivity in Arla. But you can't come home again. He looks around and he discovers he's not the same person anymore. He's disgusted by the slavery he'd so thoughtlessly accepted before, of course, but also by himself, by his old values, how black and white his worldview used to be. Laurent sees this, of course, because Laurent sees everything.
Laurent said, "Play the Fall of Inachtos," and a murmur of approval passed over the hall. Colness, the keeper of slaves, congratulated Laurent on his knowledge of Accolon epics. "It's one of your favorites, isn't it?" said Laurent, transferring his gaze to Damon. It was one of his favorites. He had called for it countless times on evenings like this, in the marble halls of his home. He had always liked the depiction of Accolons cutting down their enemies, as Nisos rode out to kill Inachtos and take his walled city. He didn't want to hear it now.
At the beginning of the story, Damon is the literal captive prince, and the story is driven in no small part by his various attempts to break free from captivity. But what freedom means to him becomes more and more complicated as the story progresses. At first, it just means escaping the palace, then it means making sure the people even more vulnerable than him can also escape, then it means allying with his captor and working together to achieve progress and compromise to protect 2 nations worth of vulnerable people, until finally freedom to Damon means freedom for everyone, the literal abolition of slavery in Aklos and a commitment to end the cycle of violent imperialism perpetuated by all the kings before him, including his own father. Freedom means breaking free from the harmful cycles of the past. Laurent is also literally captive to his uncle's abuse. At some point before the story begins proper, we know the sexual abuse stopped, but the gaslighting and the psychological abuse never did. Self-blame and feelings of complicity are incredibly common in victims of childhood sexual abuse, and the victim's intense shame regarding the actions they took to survive can sometimes lead them to mistakenly believing that they were a willing participant in their own abuse. That seems to be the case with Laurent, and the Regent in classic abuser style does everything he can to encourage the narrative that Laurent, as a 13-year-old boy, was somehow asking for it, and we can see Laurent wrestling with this throughout the series. Because, in a way, assigning the blame of his abuse to himself allows Laurent to retain a sense of control. And we know that cultivating control is Laurent's main coping mechanism as well as his primary means of navigating the world. But that narrative, that he's to blame because there's something just fundamentally wrong with him that makes him worthy of abuse, enables Laurent's own abusive behavior. The idea that he's somehow innately wrong and bad and broken is the thing that allows him to so easily hurt other people, especially people that he sees himself reflected in. Aymeric is another victim of the Regents and is 19, just a year younger than Laurent. Also, like Laurent, he's no longer being sexually abused, but the Regent has strung out his manipulation and grooming over the years in order to retain his loyalty so he can use him against Laurent when the time is right, which he does. Aymeric is very much like the protagonist of My Dark Vanessa in that he's trying desperately to believe that his childhood abuse was actually a consensual love affair. And Laurent despises him because he sees himself, his own vulnerability and shattered hopes, in him. In Aymeric, Laurent sees all the most hated parts of himself laid bare. Looking at Aymeric is like looking at himself, and if he looks too hard, he's gonna have to confront what he sees, a lonely young man with no control over the fact that he was manipulated and abused by someone who should have cared for him. Damon cuts right to the heart of this in King's Rising.
"I know," said Damon, "that I did hurt you." Laurent's motionlessness was careful. Even his breathing was careful. He didn't turn back to look at Damon. I hurt you, Laurent. That's enough. Stop, said Laurent. It wasn't right. You were just a boy. You didn't deserve what happened to you. I said that's enough. Is it so hard to hear?
In true Picot fashion, we're talking about two things at once here. Damon is referring to killing Auguste and acknowledging the responsibility of what he personally took away from Laurent, but even though he doesn't know it at this moment, he's also talking about the abuse and asking Laurent to finally lay down the burden of his own blame. And if Laurent can forgive himself, he can forgive others. He can forgive Damon and finally let go of the compulsion to seek revenge that's been preventing him from loving fully. And that's what finally frees Laurent from the cycle, but we're not only talking about the cycle of abuse anymore. We're talking about freedom from the cycle of endless retributive justice. At this point in the story, Damon and Laurent are finally able to address the violence and harm they've caused each other without creating more violence and harm. And based on that mutually radical decision, they're able to create a new kingdom that's freer for everyone. And of course, this shift to a transformative model of justice is largely metaphorical. This is still a medieval fantasy world ruled by an absolute monarchy. Come on. But like I said earlier, that layer of abstraction is also the power of fantasy. It's building a world with two countries trapped in an endless cycle of violence and retribution, and then asking the reader to consider, does it have to be this way? Can we build something better? Something that comes up in a lot of conversations about all media that deals with dark and disturbing subject matter, but especially queer media because it's looked at with quadruple the scrutiny, is why would someone want to read about these awful, terrible, no good things happening? It's often a pretty loaded, judgy, pearl-clutching question, but I'm going to attempt to answer it in good faith. In her video Beauty and Ugly Times, Abigail Thorne talks about perfume. Now, I didn't know anything about perfume before watching this video, but it turns out that you can't just mix together a bunch of nice smelling stuff and get a good perfume. Perfumers will commonly add these nasty, funky scents that smell terrible on their own, but when you use them alongside sweet, flowery, lovely smells, what was a bad smell in isolation now adds weight and richness and complexity. Together, they create balance. I will never forget reading Prince's Gambit for the first time. It was a cold night, February 2021, and I was sitting at my kitchen table. I'd been reading this thing for hours. I just started it the day before, but I couldn't put it down. We spend most of the book alongside Damon, gradually opening up to Laurent and beginning to trust him as he does the same for Damon. And Laurent never becomes warm or friendly exactly, that's just not who he is. But he does become delightful in his own uptight way, as we observe through Damon's eyes as Damon falls in love with him. We start to forget what he can be like on a bad day. And then near the end of the book, Laurent has a very bad day. Aymeric has betrayed them because of his misplaced loyalty to the regent, and now he's being held prisoner at Ravenel, the fort Laurent's just taken, and in their post-victory mood, some of the soldiers are gearing up to torture and abuse Aymeric. Jordan and Damon are thinking Laurent will be the voice of reason and put a stop to it, but that's not what happens. Instead, Laurent privately sequesters Aymeric and proceeds to physically and verbally abuse him himself. His behavior is fiendish in a way we haven't seen since book 1. He weaponizes all of his worst, foulest, least generous thoughts about himself and hurls them back at Aymeric, who's promptly reduced to tears, and he would have kept going if Damon hadn't put a stop to it. Things simmer for a while, and then a few scenes later, he lays into Damon, weaponizing the private, vulnerable things Damon said to him while they were intimate, and also weaponizing what he secretly knows about Damon's true identity, mocking what happened to him and his family. It is breathtakingly cruel and incredibly painful to read, and it winds down like this.
Laurent's laugh was a strange, breathless sound. Didn't you hear anything that I just said to you? Yes, said Damon. You tried to hurt me, and you have. I wish you would see that what you have just done to me is what your uncle is doing to you.
And that's when it clicked for me. When I was in an abusive relationship, I often felt like the worst, ugliest version of myself. And how do I put this? That perception wasn't just in my head. The relationship ended, a decade passed, and on an intellectual level, I came to understand that the abuse I'd experienced was wrong, but I had all these painful memories of me acting like the worst version of myself and all the terrible things I said and did to cope that kept me from fully believing that I wasn't somehow at fault. No matter how vile Laurent's actions were, no matter the depths he stooped to, no matter the abuse he inflicted on other people, he still did not deserve to be abused. I was only able to make that connection because Picot was willing to go there. Me having that revelation was possible not in spite of how low Laurent sank, but because of it. Because if he didn't deserve to be abused, if he's not innately broken and wrong, he is now an active participant in his own destiny. He can choose to leave his uncle behind, he can choose to be better, he can choose to love, he can choose forgiveness, he can choose to end this cycle, and he does, and so can I. I think it's okay if you don't like Captive Prince. I think it's okay if you think Captive Prince is problematic even, but I think it's good that it exists and that we can talk about it together, and I guess that's kind of the whole reason I wanted to make this video. I'm worried. right now, about the world, and about art, which is one of the most important tools we have for finding and making meaning of our individual and collective lives. I finished writing the script right as the Supreme Court announced they'd overturned Roe v. Wade, with Clarence Thomas going so far as to say he's eyeing Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell next. Meanwhile, Susan Collins is complaining about Kavanaugh not playing fair, and Joe Biden is surrounding himself with riot cops and urging protesters to be peaceful. So we've got one group of people actively working to strip away our human rights, and another group smugly trying to claim the moral high ground in a fight where their opponents literally have no morals. It's a clown show. And the circus is playing out over here in book world too, because fascists hate the arts, because fascists fear thinking deeply, questioning authority, and imagining alternatives. So we have these right-wing nuts banning queer books while purposefully and casually conflating them with pornography and pedophilia. And then on the left, we keep trying to prove them wrong about us as if they care that they're wrong. When we attempt to depict ourselves, we're often so paralyzed by our fear of imperfection that we give up before we start, opting instead to tear down each other's work for the sake of content and clout. Or when we do try, we twist ourselves into knots in an attempt to create the most unobjectionable, morally superior, sexless art that we can, in hopes that if we make ourselves as benign and unthreatening as possible, perhaps the people trying to ban our stories from being told will magnanimously come to the conclusion that we do deserve rights, actually. Fuck that. It's never gonna work. They're gonna keep moving the goalpost because they don't want to understand. They want to exterminate us. We need to stop trying to persuade them. We need to drown them out with such an abundance of our stories that they won't be able to make a dent. There's a place for Heartstopper, and it's a prominent one. Young people being able to see examples in media of how coming to terms with yourself and your identity can actually be a positive and uplifting experience, and that their queerness doesn't mean they're destined for a life of isolation and pain, is incredibly powerful. But queer people also grow up into adults, if they're lucky, who are messy and complicated and often traumatized, and we're doing ourselves a huge disservice by scrubbing those elements from our stories in order to make them more palatable to the widest possible audience. Wholesome stories with good representation, yes, but also stories that are weird and scary and dark and feature imperfect people making bad choices and still trying to do better. The term hope punk was coined by Alexandra Rowland in a 2017 Tumblr post, and it gave a word to a set of ideas and themes that have been bubbling up in genre fiction and fan fiction for a while. A lot of people mistakenly think hope punk is about sweetness and cozy vibes, but it's not. It's punk. It's inherently political. It's messy. It's a constant fight. It's a weirdo on the outskirts who can see a better future and keeps pushing for it, heedless of the people who think they're too radical or that they're asking for too much. It's understanding the fight will never be over, but demanding joy anyway. I think Captive Prince is hope punk in the way it infuses a dark, intense, struggle-filled story with shameless love and joy. Because Captive Prince understands what hope punk understands. There will never be one singular moment of choosing good over evil. The story is that of one long, continuous, unending, infinite struggle, and if you're gonna have joy at all, and you can, and you should, then you've got to learn to find it in the dark. Hey pals, post-production Mel here. This has been my most ambitious creative project to date. I worked really hard on this, and if you actually watched the whole thing, thank you so much. I have plans to do more videos like these. I would describe my vision for the content on this channel as where BookTube meets RedTube. So if that appeals to you, click the little subscribe button and the bell, do the things. I am also on TikTok and Twitter and Instagram, so you can follow me on there. And if you like the song that's playing right now, my husband composed it just for me to use on this channel. He is indeed on Bandcamp. Okay, that's it. Duck and say bye.